Hi there, I'm Greg Burnham. I write a blog called Lamada about the intersection of math and AI. And today I'm talking with Elliot Glazer, who is the head mathematician behind FrontierMath, an AI benchmark that I've written about before. Hi, Elliot. How you doing?
Good. How are you? And yeah, so thanks for writing about my project. It was actually just kind of incidental. On the shortly after you published that, two different people in my friend group who don't know each other both sent it to me, and I just was like, yeah, this is a really well-written analysis of frontier math, like basically as good as someone could possibly written using the limited amount of public information
Mm.
available at the time. So I
All right.
decided to reach out to Greg, and I'm excited to be talking to him today.
Oh, I really appreciate that. Yeah, I haven't been blogging for that long, so that was really a thrill that you picked up on it, and I was pretty honest with my assessment in that post, including some critical elements. So I'm glad that resonated. But yeah, so let's hop into
I
it.
mean, if you didn't criticize me, I would have said you were being too obsequious.
Right,
No,
right.
no, yeah, I thought you were pretty much nail on the head on like the thing on the ups and downs of the project.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to drill into some of that. Before we get started, just could you give us a quick background on yourself? How did you come to be working on Frontier Math?
Sure. So I finished my PhD in math a little over a year ago at Harvard, and it was in choiceless set theory. And I'm actually still an active mathematician. I still research choiceless set theory and subsystems of ZFC. And just this weekend, I was at a conference in Florida uh, where I was able to give a talk on some of my recent research that I actually did in this office building here.
Very nice.
So even though I'm not in academia anymore, I'm still able to do my research. It's just that I realized around the time I was finishing my PhD that AI's progress was wild and unpredictable, and it didn't seem like academia was the right place to throw my hat in. So, as much as I enjoy doing pure math, I chose to seek employment in work related to AI.
And for those who don't know, what is your employer? Just to get that on the table.
Sure, I work at Epoch AI, a nonprofit organization that researches the trajectory of AI.
Very good. Yeah, I mean, it's the dream to get to work on math and also have your hands on something both, practical broadly, but also as consequential as AI seems like it, is and will be, and just being able to try to understand that from a mathematical point of view. Anyway, I certainly find that to be, a very compelling area. So yeah, let's get into it. Can you, I mean, frontier math, if anything, is sort of I think, really trying to get a handle on how good are AI systems at math? How do we measure that? Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the project? Where did the idea come from? How did it evolve? What can you share about that?
Sure. My ability to speak on this is a bit limited because Epoch conceived of frontier math before I joined.
Sure.
My understanding is Tamai, who is the associate director, was in conversations with Nat Freeman about. I think the things they were discussing at the time. This was a little about a year ago.
Mhm.
Was how benchmarks of AI were getting saturated very fast, and they wanted something that was more difficult and would last a while, but still be an objectively correct, valid source information. So mathematics, which is about as objective of a science as it gets, seemed like a natural choice for them. And they did a pilot version of Frontier Math that was a smaller and much easier. And eventually, I think a few months later, Epoch was able to secure funding with OpenAI.
Mhm.
And it was actually conversations there that helped my bosses realize that it needed to be much harder than it was if they wanted it to last, even a year out, because Basically they were told that their models are improving so fast, anything that's just currently barely outside of AI's range will be grasped by it shortly. So they lowered the quantity. I think it was originally going to be on the order of like 1,000 problems to end up being only 300 problems with more of an emphasis on high difficulty. And Timai and Ege, who's a senior researcher, decided to pass the product on to an actual mathematician.
Gotcha.
So it was actually, the timing was very the timing was great for me. Right as like I'm in the middle of my job search, I see like this ad for like what seemed like a perfect opportunity for me, so I went for it.
Gotcha. Okay, so they maybe were considering something that, based on advice from OpenAI, was going to get saturated too quickly and maybe therefore not be that informative. And hence the version of FrontierMath that has been published so far. I know you're working on additional versions, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think that question of difficulty, like target difficulty for the benchmark, is really interesting. Clearly, one of the goals is for it to be harder than existing benchmarks. I have a couple questions about that. Like, one angle is there's a lot of unsolved math problems out there. You could just catalog those. Obviously, that wasn't the direction you chose. So I guess I've got a multi-part question. One is, did you consider that? And why did you, not go in that direction if difficulty is just, is so important?
Well, we did consider that, and we are still considering that. We have various projects in the works based around the idea of studying AI's progress on certain known problems for which, certain open problems for which it would be concretely verifiable when AI progresses on it. One I suggested for this was finding new records for longest known arithmetic sequence of primes. Since once it's found, it can be verified efficiently. It's a polynomial time problem check primality, and we know that there are arbitrarily long such sequences by the Green-Tau theorem, but it's very hard to efficiently find them. And I don't think I think the current record is 27-ish in terms, you can look it up, but it's around 25, 27 is the current record. So we are actually beginning the process of cataloging such problems, and we're considering making a product off of that.
Gotcha. So automatic verifiability was sort of the big roadblock in unsolved problems?
Well, the reason why we're in this, but FrontierMath does have a rather separate goal. It is important in FrontierMath that the problems do have a known answer. Basically, I would say the point of this is the point of FrontierMath is to get a better understanding of AI's progress towards reaching human level. So this requires us, one, that problems actually be solved by humans, and also for us to have some sense of what its difficulty is. It's really hard to figure out the difficulty of an open problem. Like, I imagine, if you poll mathematicians about the famous conjectures and what orders they will eventually be solved in, they would kind of resemble a random permutation because people have such different instincts on these things. The only thing we know is if we have tried, however hard we've tried thus far is a lower bound, but the upper bound is literally infinite. Like, a problem could literally be independent of the standard axioms, and it could be independent that it's independent, independent that it's independent, ... So, FrontierMath, so the advantages are that we do know the answers, and we know where it stacks up in the line of, high school math Olympian to professional researcher, where these problems lie. And we can use this to benchmark how close AI is to the pinnacle of humanity.
Right. So the ability to, and I think baked into that a little is you kind of expect some degree of progress given the trajectory that AI systems are on. I mean, one question and I feel like this is a limited perspective, maybe not really my preferred perspective on this topic, but would you consider it a failure if frontier math was saturated by the end of the year? And by saturated, I mean if systems were achieving within the error bars of 100% performance. Would you consider it a failure if frontier math was saturated by the end of the year? And also, would you consider it a failure if it isn't saturated in 10 years or n years for some value of n? I'm curious if you have sort of a gut take on that.
Yeah, first off, in terms of error bar, you're referring to the fact that some percentage of the problems probably have wrong answers. So technically,
yeah, exactly. I appreciate it in the paper, and I didn't write about this in my post, but I appreciated in your paper that you did a resampling analysis of, after you were sort of done with V1, you took, I think it was 30 problems or so, and had them reviewed a second time and found 2 of them had fatal flaws, like the answer was wrong or the problem was poorly formulated. I appreciated that transparency because I think, everyone sort of knows all benchmarks of any scale have that problem with them. So yes, that's all I meant by error bars. So, call it more or less 100%, but knowing that 100% might not be possible because it's so unfortunately difficult to stamp out every error. That's exactly right.
Sure, and yeah, even though we do have our final 300 problem list, we are still making sure that we're still on the search for errors and trying to get that error rate down.
Yeah.
But yeah, so in terms of the idealized perfect score of just answering all the possible questions correctly, and then what percentage of that. So if say 90% of the possible problems were solved by end of the year. Okay, one possibility is that would mean AI was really that good, in which case Frontier Math didn't fail. It just pointed out that reality. So that would be a success. As impressed as I have been by AI, I would still think more likely that if it was achieved this year, that would just kind of speak poorly of some of the design in Frontier Math. And we're already seeing some glimmers of this, where I think some of the problems suffer from being too guessable. Guessable. So when I say a guessable problem, I mean basically any way in which a model can reach the correct answer of a problem without legitimately going through most of the rigorous reasoning needed to justify it.
Right.
But I don't think this has come up yet in this conversation, but just a reminder for those who have not followed Frontier Math very closely, it's not a proof-based test. All problems request closed form values, usually integers or symbolic real numbers. This was largely done just out of convenience, where by having it in this format, it's easy to check. The alternatives being we demand models submit English language proofs that have to be verified by a human judge, which would be extremely unwieldy and make it very hard for us to do any evaluations.
Right.
Or 2, we could do a lean version where we implement problems into a lean client, formalize problems, and demand formalized proofs.
Gotcha.
We are interested in this project, but there's a lot of limitations to doing a lean benchmark, such as the fact that Lean doesn't even have Lean is still missing a lot of undergraduate mathematics, let alone graduate and research level topics. So we would only be able to test certain subfields of math right now if we were to design a Lean benchmark today. But we are still interested in doing some sort of project of this form.
It's just different. I mean, it's just a different kind of benchmark for those who. I'm realizing we are playing fast and loose with what our listeners may know or not know, but we'll try to correct this as we go. So lean is an automatic theorem, if not prover, at least verifier. So you can write a math proof in a natural language like English, and then another mathematician reads it, and maybe they think it makes a lot of sense, or maybe they find an error in it, but you're always a little unsure whether that's been checked with the utmost rigor. Or you can translate that proof into a formal language. Lean, L-E-A-N, is one such example. It's a programming language specialized for this purpose. And if you write a proof in Lean, you can sort of get full logical rigor on whether that proof is correct, whether all your deductions or inferences are correct. Loosely speaking, I don't know much about Lean beyond what I just said. But that's sort of the value from doing that. And there are AI systems that produce proofs in Lean. Most famously, I guess, Alpha Proof by DeepMind created some Lean proofs for International Math Olympiad questions this past 2024, this past IMO. And that, is certainly interesting. So, but I sort of like how FrontierMath approached the problem verification angle. It requires creatively squeezing sort of the fact that you found the solution, which may involve a lot of proof, creatively squeezing that into the ability to write down a particular number or a particular, symbolic real, so to speak. But more or less, you can round that off to, a large integer or a formula that's, hopefully would be challenging to come up with if you hadn't done all that mathematical reasoning, but it does leave you open to what you're talking about, guessability.
So and it's the ideal problem will have the property that if you have found the integer, almost surely you did the reasoning. It's
Right.
just that it's not everyone succeeded at that ideal, and it's really hard.
Right.
And we are gonna do some compilation of lessons we've learned from the ways models have cheesed various problems, just to provide for future contributors a sort of a little mini handbook on how not to have your problem get cheesed by AI.
Right.
So hopefully we'll have a lower error rate, not error rate, but like a lower weakness rate of that.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense that's an iterative thing. And I'll get to some questions about test solving as well. And I want to dive in because we're treating FrontierMath as a bit of a black box at the moment. I want to talk about what's inside the box. But one more framing question. I mentioned, I don't think the timelines are exactly sort of the right way to think about it. And you said exactly the reason. Maybe if FrontierMath is solved by an AI system, that just means the AI system is that good at math. Could you say a little bit more about what your target for that good means? Because I think we know the FrontierMath problems don't totally encapsulate all activities undertaken by mathematicians, but what do you hope FrontierMath to reflect in terms of mathematical activities that if an AI system did solve it, it would sort of suggest that AI system was as good at humans at what?
That's a good question. So since you're phrasing in terms of what my ideal is,
Sure,
I
please.
can speak in such terms without worrying too much about to what extent we've achieved that. But that might be your next question. But for now, I think what I've written online about our difficulty tiering system gives some insight into that. So we have a fine-grained difficulty scaling system, which I think we'll get more into later. But one thing that we do after we collect difficulty ratings along various axes is squeeze that into one of three numbers, representing three tiers of difficulty that we intended FrontierMath to test. Tier 1 roughly being hard undergraduate math. This is stuff like Putnam problems, arguably a sufficiently creative IMO problem, but also things like starred exercises in a undergraduate math course. So that would be, by comparison, a starred exercise in a textbook would require perhaps more background knowledge than a typical Putnam problem, but maybe not as much of a test of creativity. Tier 2, our goal was more like problems that a grad student would face in a graduate course or in a qualifying exam, things that show that they are really learning the details of an advanced subject, Still not really necessarily demanding much creativity. I guess this would also include then a sufficiently creative undergraduate problem, or like I guess a sufficiently undergraduate problem would be something like an REU research problem.
I see what you mean. Yeah, this is the challenge of collapsing into tiers. I mean, there's no avoiding that, but I hear you. That's helpful to sort of hear. And then, yeah, I'm sorry, not to cut you off there too. So
yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that what I'm even trying to do with this tiering system is at all possible in any principled way. We're only trying to do the least bad we can with it.
of course.
And in tier 3, our goal was problems that were like early researcher level. This is sort of a phrasing that can be a bit confusing because we aren't suggesting that doing a tier 3 problem amounts to genuinely doing a research project. It's more like, what are the prowesses that you would expect an early researcher in the field to have? What sorts of mastery would they need to begin really tackling the interesting questions in their field? And what might be a first problem a PhD advisor would give their students to help them start exploring their field before they tackle a long-term project. And that's kind of the area I was hoping tier 3 would conceptualize.
That's helpful and interesting to hear because I think I've done pretty limited math research, like an REU. So this is all from more observation and hearing secondhand. But the sense I have of what constitutes math research is, it's a messy and long-term process, and that itself doesn't seem like necessarily what the content of FrontierMath is about. Maybe if I could say it back to you, a good tier 3 problem might be something like, say, a full professor, an experienced mathematician, with the hindsight of having completed some larger research program, a real long-term research project that, as they were doing it live, had all sorts of twists and turns and dead ends and asking the wrong questions and just being stuck for long periods of time. But then with the benefit of hindsight, you can often present things more cleanly and say, and now at this point in my bigger research paper, I wanted to set out to answer this specific question, which itself required mastery of the field, requires some clever tricks, requires, executing on those ideas and working through all the computations, and sort of with the benefit of that hindsight, you can frame the problem nicely. But it was like a key element of that broader research project. Is that a fair way to sort of say what you hope to encapsulate in those tier 3 problems?
That's definitely the kind of thing that endeavor is of a difficulty that I would associate with some of the tier 3 problems. Of course, again, because of linearity, this also will include sometimes just really creative or really execution intense versions of tier 2 problems.
Sure.
So every description I give of these 3 tiers that is this simple will be a lie. Ultimately, the most honest thing I can say is that these were our attempts to sort the problems into 3 large buckets of difficulty. And I'm kind of ex post facto sort of saying what the philosophies behind each one is.
Fair enough. So let's go a level deeper. And this is probably the main thing I liked about FrontierMath.
And then some reminder, the question you had asked was, then what do I intend to mean when a model is saturated? This?
Yeah.
And again, then at that point, it just, what does this mean tier by tier? I would hope that a model that is saturated, the tier 1 subset, is as strong as a really strong undergraduate who has some combination of context experience, but also has a lot of advanced course on their belt.
Yep.
Tier 2 being like an amalgam of early grad students who have chosen to pursue various subfields of mathematics, and the sort of combined insights they might have. A tier 3 saturating model would be some sort of amalgam of early researchers ready to tackle big projects along the diverse subfields of math.
So actually, and that I think helps shed some light on some of the comments by professional mathematicians that you solicited as part of FrontierMath, some of whom were contributors to the FrontierMath problems, but saying things to the effect of, if you could solve, and I think you've since clarified, they were talking about tier 3 in particular, if an AI system could solve all the tier 3 problems, it would be something like a useful assistant, where the full-fledged mathematician, I don't know what the best word for that is, the full-fledged mathematician would still have to come up with the research program, like the broad overarching vision, might have to set direction, and might even have to sort of make a blueprint for what we're going to do, but then could potentially hand off, these circumscribed problems that nonetheless required that tier 3 level ability to solve, and that would be useful. Like that would sort of be, for an idealized tier 3 certified AI system, would be useful to a professional mathematician in that capacity. Is that, I feel like that makes sort of accords with those comments. Does that match your understanding of sort of what the Fields medalists you interviewed said about the benchmark?
That's right. So we interviewed back in October Terry Tao, Timothy Gowers, Richard Borchards, and also the math competition god himself, Evan Chen, about the problems. So specifically, what we had sent them were the tier 3 problems we had finished at the time. And so this was the one source of confusion, is that I think people thought that they had seen all of the frontier math. We had phrased it as this was their response to our research math problems. That was like a very sloppy phrasing. We literally meant this is a subset that was pre-selected to be as hard as possible that we had them. And so I'm sorry that a lot of people thought that we had made it seem like that was a representative sample. But anyway, so yeah, so that's what we showed them, and their comments were roughly along the lines of that was what their impressions were of what it would mean for a model to solve the tier 3 problems. Of course, no one of these mathematicians is omniscient with respect to all of the different fields of math, and even they would all acknowledge that they would need to do some background study before they could tackle what would be considered even an easy problem if it is far enough from their expertise. And so yes, like they all said, like, yeah, I don't know how to solve most of these, but I don't think this was them endorsing them as genuinely research level problems.
Sure. Yeah, I think, that's one of the things that's so interesting about the differences between a human system and an AI system doing math is, to a human, math can have a bit of a sticker shock's not the right word, but a first impression of, like, if you're unfamiliar with an area, you just have no idea what's going on in a problem statement. That can be very intimidating. But once you are able to map that to something you do understand, or just brush up on the background, something that looked intimidating to begin with can look easy or, trivial even, and you wouldn't know it. You wouldn't know if it was trivial. It's almost like if a problem is written in a language I don't speak, like if a math problem were written in Chinese, which I don't speak, it would be unintelligible to me, but it might be a simple arithmetic word problem. I wouldn't know. We have to sort of do that translation. AI that's been pre-trained on enough math content anyway, like the LLM-based AI systems, don't have that problem. It's like all familiar to them, but they still might make these sort of mistakes a human would never make of just sort of glossing over or bluffing. Humans bluff all the time, but good math students don't, and admit it when they're stuck, and the AI systems seem to have a problem with that. And so you have this funny element where just because an AI system can solve something that's unfamiliar to me, I may think that looks really impressive superficially, but then that reflects something very different than a harder problem that may also look equally familiar. Anyway, let's
so that represents one of two different ways in which a problem that might be impressive to even a Fields medalist might not really be that big of a sign when it's solved. One being if they have lack of experience in that subfield, but even then, like, mathematicians who do fully understand the difficulty of the mathematics of the problem will sometimes fail to recognize the wide array of tricks a model might use to jump to the answer without proving all the lemmas.
Yeah, and that gets back to guessability. I mean, I will say just one thing. My experience of most people who are at the very top of their game is they're very modest, at least in math. And I don't mean to say it's false modesty, but it just must be a different experience in life to, you know, be kind of brilliant and have the whole world think you're brilliant. And I don't know what you do with that. So maybe sometimes you say things look challenging and then you work on them. I mean, I know Tao has sometimes worked on problems that mathematicians like advise you. Like Tao has made progress on the Collatz conjecture. That's sort of mathematicians advise each other not to bother working on because it's impossible to make progress. And Tao has made some progress on that. It's a little bit like you have to be sheepish when you're like, okay, I did make progress on this impossible problem no one's supposed to work on. Anyway, so I think these comments also are just coming in a human way from a kind of funny place. Just to add one more element to parsing these comments, but I also thought they made some comments that were straightforward about we don't expect the passing tier 3 of FrontierMath to suggest that it can take over the jobs that mathematicians do in terms of these bigger research agendas, which I think sort of fits. And then, yeah, I
agree with that much, yes.
And I don't believe Evan Chen that these problems are above his pay grade. Like, I think that is a bit of appropriate modesty, but also just a reflection of background, or, you know, so anyway, I found some of this a little like, what, you know, whatever. There's no, you know, can't think of many better candidates. Anyway, let's go into FrontierMath. I really liked your system. So let me say, I mean, we're halfway through this discussion and haven't really defined FrontierMath. So let me just briefly say,
oh yeah, that
300 problems, math problems, meant to be of the level of difficulty that you said with, that you have characterized very nicely in these tiers, you know, very nicely, as best you can in these tiers, with automatically verifiable answers so that you don't need a human in the loop for verifying those answers, sourced from dozens and dozens of mathematicians, reviewed at least once by other humans, and now mostly kept private by OpenAI and Epoch AI, your organization, to resist training data contamination. So the hope anyway is that these problems are sort of a good holdout set for testing mathematical ability, but still something you can automate. So yes, as a set, like, fine. Sorry, anything you'd add to the basic contours of the data set?
That's fine for now. Going
good. So as I said, fine, but you have to look in the box to really know what you're getting. And so here you characterized problems in their difficulty along 3 dimensions: background, meaning how much mathematical background would be required to answer the question; creativity, which is about how much you have to sort of go off the beaten path from known approaches to solving problems, or think about ways to combine existing approaches or well-known facts in unusual ways; and then execution, which is once you do have the basic idea, how long and how difficult is it to sort of work out that solution. I liked these 3 dimensions. I was curious if you could just talk about, how did you develop those? Did you consider others, ultimately exclude them? Now that you've been at it for a while, are you considering adding any others? What was your thought process there?
I wasn't the one who chose to have these 3 categories. That was, I think it was Ege who made that system, because it was already here when I got here.
Sure.
I thought it was like a very natural way to factor problem difficulty, and seems robust to even like the most advanced research level math problems. Like, you know, you can look up any recent major results, like the proof of the 3-dimensional conjecture, and you can go through it and you can sort of factor what were the key steps here in terms of, one, how much background knowledge do you need to even begin to start reading through this proof? Right. To in this 100-page paper, how many points was there actually a very surprising next step? Mm-hmm. Like what would seem to be a creative epiphany. And then between each creative epiphany, creative epiphanies, like how much labor, manual labor do you have to do to go through all of the steps there?
Yep.
So I think it's got a very nice, robust system, and it'll scale high. It'll scale well to even like problems that are beyond the FrontierMath scope. So I like it, and then never felt the need to change it.
Gotcha. Good. So yeah, I liked that too. I think those are, as we were discussing a little earlier, do break apart these sort of separatable dimensions of problem solving. Of course, now the rubber meets the road with actually trying to measure those. And I know, well, actually, let me just ask, do you have any plans to sort of share some of those broken down stats? Like, I'm curious how much the different dimensions correlate, or how the FrontierMath data set breaks down on ratings for each problem, where background, I know I'll just say for the audience, you've got 5 tiers of difficulty ranging from like upper level high school to, the sort of early career researcher, and stages in between. And then for creativity and execution, you've got number of hours, like hours it would take to come up with those epiphanies, such as they are, smaller epiphanies for lower tier problems. And then execution is how many hours to work that out. So those are obviously unbounded. I mean, it could, Wiles worked on Fermat's last theorem for 7 years, so they say, and so whatever, how many hours that is, that's some mix of creativity and execution. But I'm
curious. Yeah, that's an unbound scale that also like has to deal with the fact that, let's be real, skill level does matter here. So, all the practical realities of how one, like how are even operationalizing it. And if we do choose an operationalization, like say your idealized person who's like, let's say like the most skilled in the relevant area or whatever, how well then can arbitrary reviewers simulate that person and make good guesses about it, or how well do 2 reviewers tend to correlate in their ratings? So far, we often get like, rather large gaps between different mathematicians' opinions. So what I sort of did was that, I would simply average any scores I got, but in terms of the actual, then for like the final 1, 2, 3 tiering, this is again how that relates to why that was more of an art than a science. Because if I took any, if I tried to make the tiering system like it's as a function from triples of those axes to final answer, well, suddenly you're just gonna get huge biases. Like, what if my 2 number theory reviewers happen to be harsher in their reviews? Now it suddenly seems like we have a ton of number theory in the high tiers. So yeah, so I mean, at this point, I really don't want to say that our system is much more than vibes based. Like, this is what we intended to capture. We've had ideas of how to operationalize it better than we have been. So far, I don't think that we have yet come up with a system that is reliable, in the sense that if I right now hired a new team of reviewers and had them all do the same process I've given the ones thus far, I'm not that convinced that all the numbers would align that much with the original ones. So we are working towards kind of coming up with like a better strategy for coming up with these values, how to make them more precise, and how to make them have, how to extract more predictive content from these estimates that we are being provided. But yes, that's so. In terms of the idealized version of this difficulty system, I still stand by that. I still think this is like a really great way to break down problem difficulty. We just need to find much better ways to assign numbers to these things. And yeah,
well, I mean, I was going to say, it's a lead into another question I wanted to ask. I think one thing that I understand about the process of creating math problems for the sort of highest stakes math Olympiads, in particular the International Math Olympiad, or sort of the pinnacle of the high school math Olympiad circuit, is there's extensive test solving. I'm even involved with a math summer program for high school students that has a quiz as part of the application process. And even that we get those questions test solved by a dozen program alumni, just to get a sense of how difficult are they. I mean, you find errors as well, but you also find a range of possible solutions. Like, there's no part of this makes me think there's no substitute for just sampling humans on this. So I know you've said a little bit here and there publicly about plans for increased test solving, or in the AI biz, I guess you call this red teaming, but more so than just finding problems or guessability strategies or things like that. I feel like that could give you a better handle on difficulty. So it's not, maybe that wouldn't be red teaming, that would just be calibrating. What are your thoughts on human test solving for frontier math problems? I know they're hard, so it's difficult, it's time consuming, it's expensive. Like, I don't mean to imply any deficiency there at this point in time, but where are you going with that?
Oh, we're going there. So this is one of the big things that we are doing to actually put some meaning behind these difficulty ratings or giving these problems. We are actually going to run an in-person competition. This is going to be, I believe, near the end of March. Mm-hmm. I'm not the one organizing this. I'm probably going to put you in touch with my colleagues Ege and Terrence after this interview if you want to learn more about our upcoming competition, because they're the ones who have been working out all the logistic details and the exact competition details. But the conceptual idea is that the only way to really get a good sense of how hard these problems are is to give them to appropriate experts. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to give, there's no point in giving anyone all 300 problems. There's a lot of them they won't even understand the words behind, right? Because each field has their own jargon. But we will give a relevant subset to mathematicians based around their expertise, and have them compete against each other for prizes. I think our prize pool is either $20,000 or $30,000. It's on our website again. Mm-hmm. Again, I'm not the one organizing this, so don't quote me on the hard details. But we want to have a good incentive to have strong mathematicians do the best on the set of problems that are most relevant to them. And in doing so, we'll be able to collect data on how hard these things really are.
That does make a lot of sense. And matching to background certainly seems like, controlling for background in general is one of my big open questions about frontier math, because, well, I'll say this, and I'm curious for your thoughts in general. I find it notable that none of the language model-based systems right now seem capable of solving even harder high school math Olympiad problems. So USAMO or IMO, harder problems there seem out of reach of O3, at least the publicly available versions of O3, which generally, OpenAI's model that generally does best on other math competitions, and I've written some about this. So I am, and what those problems are notable for is requiring very little background, sometimes high school background. You have to know some introductory number theory or something like that, but sometimes nothing at all. It's more akin to just a very tricky riddle. I'm curious, did you consider, just trying? You had Evan Chen, who writes his own practice math Olympiad. He's a math Olympiad coach for IMO contenders. Did you consider just trying to make some, a subset that was basically hard IMO problems? I feel like some of them you could squeeze into the desired answer. I'm curious if that was something.
Well, there definitely are, and one of the expertises is just competition math. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a separate category from expert in category theory, who needs to be given the category theory problems. Right. That's his own skill set, and a lot of research mathematicians never acquire the ability to solve even hard Putnam problems.
That makes so there are. This is one of the drawbacks. I think it's a good trade-off, but it's one of the drawbacks of a private data set. Is I think of the 5 problems you release publicly, none of them especially look like competition problems, but you're saying there are some more competition flavor problems akin to a problem 3 or problem 6 on the IMO or a problem 6 on the Putnam. Is that the case?
Oh yeah, we do. They can only look so much like it just because, again, the number-based format.
Yeah.
But definitely at a high level, they do have resemblance to that, and it's definitely going to be the people who are like grinding for competitions who we expect to have the best chance of getting a good score on these types of problems.
Makes sense. Cool. Well, that's yeah. I mean, that's exciting. The human testing, and seems like a very natural step you would do. And I'd love to learn more about that, and write about it, or try to help you boost the audience there for people who might be able to participate in it, which is always a challenge with these things. Let me see. I'm checking my notes on other things I wanted to ask you. Let me at least make sure I have time to ask 2 questions. One is, I know, speaking of your future plans, you're currently working on a tier 4 for FrontierMath. Could you tell us about your goals for that tier?
Yes. I mean, simply put, we want it to be, we want much harder problems. We want, I want to create a data set that does not get saturated until AI is genuinely mastered the main ideas of most of the major fields of mathematics. And I get part of the reason why I was pushing back against the quotes from the earlier tiers. So the quotes the mathematicians had about tier 3 is because I think people think that's what tier 3 is, and it's not. But we are trying to realize that really high bar of difficulty now with this project, and we now have the funding to make this happen, and 2, frankly, it's a good thing we didn't start with tier 4 because there were a lot of mistakes that I have mentioned thus far that we have learned from, so that not only will we be able to hire the type of top profs we need to make tier 4 happen, but also we're going to have like lots of screening for the kinds of errors that resulted in problems that had been rated tier 3 getting solved by rather lame heuristics.
Gotcha. Would you characterize that? So, well, let me say, sounds like tier 4 is what tier 3, what you hoped for tier 3 all along. And I would say, I mean, my 2 cents, whatever, I'm just some guy, but my 2 cents is like, that's normal. Like, it's normal that your first cut of a product isn't doesn't meet the vision for the product, and you have to put it out there and let it get beat up, and like don't worry about it. That's perfectly normal. And not like any mathematician's ever been a perfectionist or anything, so I understand why you'd feel some consternation about that. Anyway, so tier 4, what tier 3 should have been, and we characterized that a bit earlier. Just to hit it again, what would you say were some of the, what were the main stumbling blocks that held tier 3 back from being what you wanted it to be? Heuristic guess abilities 1, you could expand on that. Are there any others? I'm curious to hear what you say there.
Yeah, this will be easier to explain, probably next week once we have our next set of 5 public problems come out. The first sets that are currently available were done by a random selection, 1 from each tier of difficulty.
Sure,
it's 5 problems, so it was more like quintiles, but whatever. So that's how we did the first public sample. Yeah. But like I said, now that we're finally seeing models that can get pretty impressive scores on FrontierMath, we're able to get a better sense of what actually is hard for problems, and our internal ratings of difficulties have not been that well correlated with which problems got solved first. So the next 5 set of public problems will be based around demonstrating different things we have learned from this process, rather than based off of what we had guessed would be the relative difficulties.
Gotcha.
That will, for example, include some problems that I would have been shocked to be solved this year that were. And what we learned, and what were the weaknesses that made that allowed AI to solve these problems, even though I still don't really think that they mastered the relevant subjects of those problems.
Yeah, and I think this is there's this important subtlety here. Our goal here, your goal here, which I support, is not to just stump AI systems. It's rather to have a measurement that reflects something we know about and are familiar with in humans. It's to have a measure that reflects a human capability, which you've described, I like the word, mastery of mathematical concepts. So the challenge is there's lots of slippery ways to come to the correct numerical answer, and you just want to make sure that you've found a problem where there's no easy trick that lets you go in through a back door. There's only the hard way to solve the problem, and anyone who can, any system, AI or human, that can solve that problem could be said to have, grappled with the relevant mathematical concepts. So, and I am just curious, just to get a clear, well, let me say as background, OpenAI has reported that O3 mini high under a certain setting got about 30% of tier 3 problems. I think they said 28%, and this was when prompted to use a Python tool, which is totally within bounds and expected for FrontierMath. So totally fair play. And its overall score was only about 30%. So that's, that correlation is where you were saying, it was more of an even spread as opposed to a tilted spread over that distribution. But looking at those problems it got right in tier 3, your sense was your sense, I don't know, entirely due to heuristics that you wouldn't have wanted there to be in those problems? Or how would you characterize, now that you've looked into some of those successes?
Well, it's still sifting through these reasoning traces. It is a ton of data. We realize that it's almost futile to do it ourselves. So actually, we have permission now to send out the reasoning traces to all of their authors. So not to anyone else, but each author gets to see how the models tackled their problems. And we're writing up, probably going to send out today, actually, the survey with asking each reference to rate, for ones where there's a reasoning trace for a correct solution, how much of the legitimate mathematical reasoning did they do? Did they find all the key steps? Was it cheesed? And various 1 to 10 questions that to start collecting data on that. And then similarly for ones where the problems weren't solved, how much progress had it made? How early on did it first make a fatal deduction that it never recovered from, etc. So we will be writing a public report over the next couple of weeks.
Gotcha.
We'll address things like, one, the survey data from the authors, what lessons we are learning, analysis of these 5 newly publicized problems that will newly be publicized, and what those show about the differences between AI difficulty versus our internal difficulty ratings.
Yeah.
And then also just go over some of the things we have learned about the 3 axes of difficulty that we've been measuring, and to what extent those correlate to difficulty. Part of that model. One thing I think I told you in a previous conversation is that I'm curious to see if any of these axes are as predictive as another metric we measured, which was how many pages long the solution was.
Totally.
We don't advertise that one because, that feels like such a naive sense of difficulty. But it's data we have, and I wouldn't be that surprised if that actually has a relatively good correlation with a problem being hard to solve by O3 Mini, just because the more steps it is, the more opportunities to hallucinate.
Totally. I mean, we know that these models have, the models we're dealing with today have challenges with what you might call long-term coherence. And I mean, it's something just bizarre to keep in the back of that I try to keep in the back of my head is O3 Mini High can't successfully multiply 20-digit numbers together. It's not able to sort of tip itself into pure execution mode the way that humans can. And, just the human, you just are okay, this is going to be really boring, but I'm going to act like an abacus right now and just do it out. That's not how these models work. So on some level, it's the same problem of correlations breaking down. Obviously, if a human can solve a research math problem, they wouldn't like doing it, but they can multiply two 20-digit numbers and get the answer right most of the time. There's studies on exactly how often, but it's pretty high. And we sort of feel like they're at least doing the right thing. And so, if you somehow have a problem that is long enough to kind of match the bookkeeping difficulty of multiplying two 20-digit numbers together, then you expect failure there. So I bet that is correlated, but not for the reasons we want. It's correlated because of a reflection of the limitations of AI systems right now, but not necessarily due to mathematical difficulty the same way. Again, it's a bit of a extreme example, but it makes a point that that multiplying two 20-digit numbers isn't like any harder for a human, is much easier for a human than solving any frontier math problem. And so that's sort of the the challenge we have there of like, we want them to be hard for the right reason. Anyway, the report you described sounds like exactly the kind of transparency and iteration that you'd hope for on trying to make an informative public benchmark. So I think that sounds really cool.
I mean, there's a lot of onus on us due to the whole private data set thing. Like, I think most people understand why the data set has to be private, but are also reasonably frustrated that so many basic questions they have can't yet be answered. So we're trying to like get the optimal compromise of, without revealing too many private things, still give out statistically clear answers to the really big questions that people are having. But one comment about like the reasoning traces and what you're saying about O3 Mini's limitations are, it's definitely a lot more impressive having these full reasoning traces than what we get online. Well, almost surely they put a lot of resources into solving these problems when they do their internal evaluations.
I see.
And it's definitely a higher, you get much better results this way than just going to chatgpt.com and trying to ask a math problem to it. That's also a source of cognitive dissonance between, wait, I heard about these great scores, but I went online and it made this really obvious mistake.
That is interesting. So that suggests that OpenAI is putting more, we know this whole test time compute paradigm lets you turn a dial for how long you let the system think, so to speak, run while trying to solve a problem. And they expose a couple preset settings for that, and it corresponds to pricing in their API. So you can go on to ChatGPT and select O3 mini or O3 mini high, which generally takes longer, but maybe is more accurate because it thinking length correlates to correctness. But you're saying that the reasoning traces you're seeing from OpenAI indicate that they might have turned that knob higher when they were running their internal evaluation on FrontierMath. And then because you don't see the same kind of, qualitatively, the same kind of traces when you go and run O3 mini high or whatever it is on ChatGPT. That's fascinating. And so sort of indicates maybe...
Which also, if you do look at their actual announcements, they do have actually multiple bars. Like one is more along the lines of just 11% that they described as, and describe the higher ones getting through some sort of tool. So my understanding here, that might not be completely accurate, is that the lower bar one is more corresponding to what you actually get when you just type in queries online with no additional scaffolding.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, it is interesting because I think their exact phrasing for this 28% result on T3 was O3 mini with high reasoning effort solves more than 28% of the T3 problems, which does sound like what should be in the API. But, anyway, I actually don't really mean to impugn OpenAI on this as well. It's a fast moving field, and it's hard to achieve the kind of transparency you want when you're trying to, keep your secret sauce secret for, in their case, for commercial reasons. But yeah, it would be great to, it'd be great. The more light Epoch plans to shed on this, the better. I think people will eat that up, or I will, if that's something you can, as you go on that journey.
Yeah, so we're not going to be able to share the reasoning traces, but we can share some qualitative observations. Like, I mean, my biggest takeaway looking at these is that I just feel like the traces are surprisingly human. in the sense that it really feels like the way it talks sort of captures sort of chaos that goes inside my own head when I'm thinking about a math problem. Where, because like the more I think about it, I constantly hallucinate. I'll quickly make a false guess. Then a different part of my brain says, that doesn't make sense. Go backwards, try again, go a different direction. It has a very similar, that sort of dialogue is actually played out in these reasoning traces where it does still hallucinate all the time, but it goes back and realizes it and course corrects until it finds a train of thought that it does not see any problems with, and then it commits to that. So it's
I found it so funny, and I wish I had a deeper explanation for this, that at least in those full chains of thought reasoning traces are not exposed like in general by OpenAI, though DeepSeek for their reasoning model R1 does expose them, and so you can really see them on any question you want. And it is so funny how human even the language they put in there is. And this is the case in a couple examples of the same traces that OpenAI released around the O1 model, where it will even just say things like, wait, is that right? Or, let me check that again. But wait, and it just keeps interjecting itself, which is exactly how I talk when doing that. I wonder, is that in the training data? Is that an emergent property of a language model? Because it is what a human would say when they're double checking something.
Because I think that a lot, but I'm usually good about not constantly verbalizing or writing up my short-term hallucinations, and I don't even know how I would begin to truly write out my stream of consciousness.
Well, if this has been published, I haven't seen it, but you do sort of get the sense that, I mean, there's sort of two ways this could go. And this is now super speculation. We can wrap up in a minute.
Sure.
But it's either that they really are just training on, did a trace, whatever was in there, get to the right answer, and some sort of reinforcement learning like loop with feedback on just the right answer, say like a numerical answer. And it's an emergent property of a language model trying to do that it's going to talk sort of like a human reasoning through that. Or did they pay some people to, really carefully write down every thought, at least in a plausible way? Because I agree with you, it's often pre-verbal in my own mind, but you could fake it sorta. If you got really good at paying attention to your own thought process. That's an interesting exercise in its own right. Yeah, so anyway, one way or another, this does seem to be it's a human characteristic, even if it's sort of funny to get to look inside another agent's, imitation of a human brain and see it a little more. Certainly amazing how fast it goes, producing so many wrong answers that we would do more.
Just like and into so wrap up like several ideas from the previous few questions into like
sure
one more, actually trying to be somewhat more eloquent here. Right, so we have these reading traces. We are analyzing how the first three tiers, especially tier 3 problems, were tackled by O3 Mini, and also looking at other frontier models like DeepSeek. We're doing the best we can to learn as much as possible about the nature of mathematical difficulty and the ways in which we have and have not captured it. So I've been somewhat self-deprecating and been happy to talk about the flaws of the project, but I still very much stand by FrontierMath, the base FrontierMath as has been released, and think we have captured a genuine signal here that these really high scores that DeepSeek and OpenAI's models are getting are genuinely showing serious progress in how much these models are studying mathematics. And with tier 4, I hope to have a much higher difficulty, one that perhaps naively praying will be able to actually survive a few years before you're truly able to capture that difficulty and avoid the heuristic mistakes that some problems in base frontier math suffered from. And yeah, so we'll release this report soon, and I am really excited to see how tier 4 plays out.
I think it's great work. I'm excited as well. I'll wrap up just saying what got me excited about frontier math to begin with, apart from a personal affinity to math, which you've got to account for, but is just that it's narrowly focused and it's meant to reflect a human skill that we have some understanding of. So, if tier 4 is what you want it to be, but doesn't resist AI progress, so much the better for AI. That just means it means something. And then I really like how, and really appreciate, as this conversation indicates, that you're committed to iterating on the benchmark. I think a lot of benchmarks get released and then sort of fall by the wayside and people aren't interested anymore once AI solves them. I think you're both shooting for something that will be inherently meaningful, but also putting in the effort to learn what this tells us about the differences in human and machine reasoning and adjust the benchmark so that it comes to measure what we really want it to measure. So I think it's great work, and clearly more work to be done, but that's keeps us employed at least for a while. So it's good stuff. Any other thoughts you wanted to share before we end the call?
I think I'm good for now, but I'm still responsive to any questions that are asked to me by email or on Twitter. So feel free to keep bugging me.
All right, very good. Well, good luck in your endeavors, and yeah, we'll be in touch. Looking forward to those next outputs.
All right. Well, thanks for talking to me, Greg.
Thank you, Elliot. Take care.
Goodbye.